I'm really honored to be here as an artist talking to a mixture of artists and scientists. It's very validating. And also, I think I represent an older generation of educators that come from an art background that didn't go to a museum studies or museum education program. So what you're going to be hearing is probably more of a personal take on what I do as both an artist, and how, as an artist, it gives me a filter to make museum programming that might be challenging institutional norms. So one of the things I wanted to talk about first is just a plug for ARTLAB Plus. We've been around about between 3 to 4 years. We're submerged in the Hirshhorn Sculpture Garden. We are a local media studio for teens. They can come after school to socialize, experiment with technology, and improve their digital skills. And then the mentors there are artists that are connected to the field, the professional field, as well as educators that can help spur on their interests. So we allow for workshops and opportunities for them to connect to those professionals, as well as meet them where they are. So there's aspects that are social, aspects that are experimental, and aspects of the programming that are more, we would say, geeked out. So, and the idea is that by using technology, it can become an entry point for both the Hirschhorn's content and the Smithsonian's content. So basically, the technology is the candy in the store window that gets them in. But it's become more than that, and I want to talk to you a little bit about my background before I talk about this space. As a contemporary artist, I try to think about, well, what time period am I living in? What is the experience of living in this time as a human being? And how do I reflect that? How do I reflect this particular cultural logic that we all live in? And how do I also talk about the cultural imagination that is used by advertising and the media and recontextualize it personally through my own artwork? So it's an interesting thing that I arrive now at designing this kind of a space where I hope that the teens that I work with will start to question the media, personalize it in ways that are more meaningful to them, and help them find meaning there. I also see technology as an extension of our mind, and that because it's an extension of our mind, it also reveals to us how our mind works. So a little bit along what the first speaker, Milton, was talking about. So I go back in history to talk about the present, and coming to the Smithsonian also allowed me to start thinking about what are the differences between all the disciplines that those 19 museums and all those museums on the National Mall are representing, and all the research behind those collections are representing. And all those disciplines and all those fields that have been siloed off into that research and funneled into those collections. And when I come back to what the early history of museums is, that it's the cabinet of curiosity. And the cabinet of curiosity is really interesting to me because it's interdisciplinary thinking. So if we were to see a contemporary version of the cabinet of curiosity, it could be a Google search. Because when we go onto a Google search, we actually are going through a space that's interdisciplinary, that allows us to do a search, for instance, in mayonnaise. First thing that comes to my head. For some reason. And I'm not hungry and I don't like mayonnaise, so I don't know what that's coming out of. So we might be looking at the filter of mayonnaise through the filter of art and design. We might be looking at it as food. We might look at it as a cultural artifact. We might look at the scientific or chemical makeup of mayonnaise, or how mayonnaise is created, or the political and economic issues related to mayonnaise. So basically, when we get on Google, it's a little bit like a swap meet, where the military-industrial complex corresponds with our life, corresponds to the way things that are created, corresponds to just human activity. So when we look at an image like this, we probably think about things like pseudoscience, where the imaginary and the scientific kind of go together, where the subjective and the objective go together. And what it does is it creates confusion, which, as an ambiguous figure myself, I also like to create as an artist, because I think that uncertainty allows us to wonder. And so what's great about this opportunity to work at the Smithsonian is to start to play with these interdisciplinary connections, to start to kind of blend science and blend art and talk about that search for meaning, that fight against uncertainty, that allows us to start to create and to avoid. One of the things, too, that's interesting about the Cabinet of Curiosity is it broke the rules of classification that we now know between the sciences and the arts. It blurred those lines and allowed for a dialogue that's very fruitful. And I think that dialogue is where innovation comes from. Also, too, when we look at a Cabinet of Curiosity, we see natural history, we see art, we see things that are uncanny, we see things that are anomalies, things that are both symmetrical and unsymmetrical. Different ways of looking at the world, different ways of perceiving the world, and in some ways, as an artist, I'm also interested in understanding how we perceive. So you can imagine coming to the Smithsonian with that kind of point of view, the challenges. The challenges were, how do I get to have those dialogues between science and art? How do I start to create a place for that to happen? Just to let you know a little bit about this picture, architecture tells you a lot about the identity of a place. So we're looking at a 19th century building. Supposedly, it actually has the body of James Smithson in it. It's a crypt in terms of the first ground floor. But it is also where the seat of bureaucracy is. So when I would work with people and I'd say, well, I have to go over to the castle because I have to deal with a management or administrative issue, people would laugh. Because with that, architecture were these values. And so that was an interesting thing for me as well. But also, too, the Smithsonian is a cabinet of curiosity. It's an opportunity with all these collections to talk about ways that things can overlap and how we can start to create meaning ourselves. The Smithsonian has 19 museums, a national zoo, and 9 research facilities. So all of those combined together is this great wealth of both objects, research, and expertise. So for me, as a person who's invested in interpretation and invested in that making of meaning, a personal meaning, when I came to the Hirshhorn, I had to think about programs that would allow for people to make their own personal connections to the works of art. So while within the silo of art history, that we can make a lot of sense of art, not everyone is initiated into art history. Not everyone knows art history, and everyone comes has different prior knowledge. So a lot of my programs when I first started the Hirschhorn were about the prior knowledge we bring to our experience and how we can make it meaningful for ourselves. The other thing, too, that's kind of interesting about the Hirschhorn Museum is that a lot of the work in it, not only is it temporal media, but a lot of the work in it, the artists are actually influenced by other fields outside of art. That artists don't work within a vacuum, that they're constantly looking at what's developing the world, again, to know and to understand what it is to mean to be in this world. So a lot of times they won't just be looking at art history, they'll also be looking at science, they'll also be looking at all kinds of research out there. So one of the programs that I worked on when I came to the Hirschhorn was something called Friday Gallery Talks. And Friday Gallery Talks were a kind of a chance for people to talk about art, but from their own point of view. So I bring in scientists, I bring in architects, I bring in anthropologists to hear their view of art through a different filter. And that created a really, I thought, very fruitful dialogue. It also allowed me to draw upon the resources of the Smithsonian to start talking about these artworks. Interesting, too, to look at this building. It's more of a brutalist building, and if we look at it, it's a circle. It tells you something very different than the Smithsonian Castle. It implies another kind of way of being in the world, and one that is this unending kind of loop of reflection. And so I think it's an interesting thing to look at the way these spaces are created. Both of these I consider architectural objects. These are objects in the world. But for me, as someone who does public programs, what does it mean to create architecture from the inside out? What does it mean to start with people and create imaginary architecture that allows these dialogues to happen, that allows a kind of a forum to happen where there's permission to talk about whatever you would like, whatever you're thinking, where any conversation is okay? So I finally so I did a lot of different kinds of programs at the Hirschhorn Museum exploring that idea of how we construct meaning using art and interpretation. when I got the chance to start working, so basically I got a grant from the Pearson Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation to start an education space in the museum. And at some point, the museum lobby did not work as that education space. And like many education spaces, we ended up outside of the museum or somewhere kind of as a satellite, which is okay, because it allowed us to be kind of like under the radar and to start to really experiment in ways that we could test things out over a period of time. My colleague at the, Kevin Hull at the Hirschhorn set a precedent already for treating teens like artists. And so this space, ARTLAB Plus, which is across Jefferson, behind the Lichtenstein, and on the National Mall, in the Sculpture Garden, became a place where teens could come in as artists, use digital media, and kind of create their own creative community. Because I think, basically, at my core, it's one thing to be an artist, and it's another thing to be an educator. And as an educator, I think there's a little bit of utopian in me. You know, there's a little person who wants to create that community that somehow spurred me on to be an artist, somehow helped me direct my own interests. And that's exactly what we try to do at the ARTLAB. We try to help teens channel their interests and discover their interests so they can pursue and take seriously what they're exploring. I was also interested in having a teen voice being added to the dialogue around art in the museum. So originally, this is what the ARTLAB looked like. It was underneath Jefferson. It was actually originally a hallway that went from the plaza under Jefferson Street and into the Sculpture Garden. And then I had heard rumors in the 80s there was a lot of homeless people living there, and basically they wanted to close it down into a space that could be used for education. So that was an interesting thing for me, which was to go into this space and think, okay, how do we make this space not a didactic space? Right now, not really creative looking, right? And when we think about it, when we spoke to teens about this space, they said it was really depressing and cave-like. So how do we get teens to come to the National Mall was one thing I had to think about. How do we create a space where they can feel that creativity and they can have that sense that they're part of some real-world activity, not just something like any other program? So we worked with a scholar named Jim Matthews from the Games, Learning, and Society group that came in as part of a mobile learning initiative through Pearson. And he had talked to us about gamifying, right? Gamifying education, creating a system where they can see themselves in a new role. And the way we gamified this space was we started thinking of it as a design studio. And that when the teens came in, they were part of creative teams that would work on projects, that there would be lead designers and there would be apprentice designers, and they all would have projects that they would work on using digital media. So rather than coming to an after-school space and it looking like an after-school space, we decided that what we would do is have a palette of technology for them to draw upon and mix and use in different ways. And not really tell them didactically how to, well, we would tell them how to use the technology, but not make any clear definitions about how to put it together, so that there was an innovation built into it, an uncertainty that allowed for that innovation. So this is kind of midway between our remodeling. And you can just see between these two spaces what's happened. We've brought in some color. The color choices, the carpet choices, the furniture, a lot of the decisions the teens were brought in, and we received buy-in from the teens to involve them in this sort of way. We also constructed a sound booth, you can see in the middle. And then you can see all the power cords are actually hanging from the ceilings. The reason why the power cords are hanging from the ceilings was that we had to deal with fire marshal and the fact that there'd be cords all over the floor. So how do we deal with that in an innovative way and still meet our needs? We hung them from the ceiling, and exhibitions helped with creating these pulley system where then teens could pull down the electricity they need to power their media. So this is part of my staff. That's Cody, Dawn, and Drew. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this space. The idea is, yes, it's still a didactic space, but everything is on wheels. So everything can change from day to day, and we try to make it change from day to day. We Also, what's not here is that there's also lounge furniture. So the social is built into the furniture in the space, as well as the experimental, as well as the geeked out or more expertise. So some parts of this space look like a classroom. Some parts of this space look like a lounge. And the idea is that we try to meet everybody for where they are. A lot of this is based on the MacArthur Foundation's 3-year study that was based on ethnographic principles about how teens learn using digital media and how they can break them down to 3 different genres of participation. And how, in some ways, we all do that we use it socially, that we learn through experimenting with it, and then once we find our interests, we pursue them through that technology. So that's all built into this space. There's things I can point out. There's screens. There's, you can see a 3D papercraft head there. Those blue boards there are actually mobile. So on one side, they're magnetic, and on the other side, they're and eraser board, on the other side, they're bulletin board. So these are very detailed. This is a very detailed explanation of what they experienced there. But it really, really was about the experience. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of a video. Oh, not that. To give you kind of an idea of what this space might look like when it's fully functioning. So there are some things that are more traditionally didactic in terms of the use of the space. You see the 2 mentors there. But you can also see that teens are able to use the space in any way that they like. There's a lot of movement. Over there's something called a cyber navigator, which tracks all of our teens as they check into the space. And they each use a card. And that card allows us to tally all the different ways they use equipment, all of the certifications they get in terms of they can assess their own digital learning skills by administrating their own tests. And also, too, rather than setting up our own website, we just use what's already out there in the public. Because in some ways, that is allowing them to have a forum and work towards that forum, like YouTube. So, and I'm getting screen confusion here. So a great, okay. So a great way to kind of talk about the ways that I see interdisciplinary learning happening here is that we also work with the Natural History Museum. And the way that we work with them is that we use technology creation again as an entry point to their collection. So that might mean things like creating video games that are based on undersea creatures and how they survive in the inner depths of the ocean. It means looking at fossils to figure out how to design organic shapes for jewelry. So the idea is to start where the teen is interested in and then work them towards science. And then at some point they can decide whether they want to go towards science or art or blend the both together. This is a great photograph for me because it shows all the different ways that we can watch simultaneous learning happening. For instance, this teen up in the front, he's actually drawing using a Wacom tablet and on a large screen. That large screen actually pulls other people in the space into what he's doing. So we use those large screens in some ways for them to see someone geeking out using technology. I know that's a derogatory term, but it actually it's a great way to explain what we all are here, which is we geek out on this kind of information. Then you'll also see back there on the table, someone's constructing a papercraft version of a dinosaur. And those papercraft is anything you can download it from a website and construct it yourself. We have a giant printer that we've been printing out. We're not sure if that dinosaur is actually going to fit in the space. We hope it does, but she has been diligently working on it. You can also see over to the right, you can see a mentor talking to a teen. So you see one-on-one mentorship, which is a big part of what we do. That's Cody, our 3D mentor, who actually, not just because he's a 3D human being, but he actually works in 3D and works with video game and digital media that allows for things like Maya, that uses Maya to create 3D imaging. He also teaches that. Back there you can see a green screen. Then you can also see the sound booth. So what happens is that the activities build the space. The activities, the needs of the people in the space are creating the architecture. So when we first started, we thought we're never going to be able to do all these things that we need in the space. But somehow, it's more about using time as opposed to using space that allows everybody to be working simultaneously on multiple projects. So there's both a workshop going on here as well as individual projects going on. And those individual projects might come out of a workshop, but they can continue to work on it too. So I guess in terms of returning back to myself as an artist and why would I be doing something like this, I think it's because I've always been interested in interpretation and how people make meaning. And when I moved from the museum and the role of interpretation with art objects to the ways that teens are interpreting their world, I felt like I was able to guide them into how to make meaning in their lives using digital media, using either art creation or science-based content. And that what that allows us to do is to create a new generation of folks who are critically thinking about what they do, breaking down boundaries between art and science, and actually, through the needs of the culture, and especially with these teens, who are, a lot of them are coming from underserved areas, create a diversity of voices in our professional fields. So that is all I have to say. Thank you.